what is the sword of trauma? Aha! This is the main thing of our entire course that we're going to be talking about, the sword of trauma. The reason this exists is to be a comparison, an analogy to trauma, so that you can see it. Now, the reason this works so well is because the concept of trauma, all trauma, like we talked about in the video before, all trauma, no matter what it is like being pierced with a sword. Okay, can you see that? Whatever anybody went through is literally like being pierced with a sword. Okay, so that's an analogy. Now, much like healing from the trauma and getting past it, although I can't stand that whole like, can't you just get past it and move on? Listen, it's all part of a process. That's why we're doing a whole course on it. Now, when you remove the sword from your body, it's kind of like comparing healing and purging the pain from whatever trauma you went through. Okay, so removing the sword. Then you have a wound that you have to heal. I've heard many survivors say like, oh, I don't have just one sword. I have a sword here and here and here and here, and I've got them all over the place. The same thing applies. You have to remove the sword of trauma, really purge it, and really face the trauma that put it there in the first place. Then you heal the wound, which is a whole nother step we'll go over in this course. And then you have it. Now, the reason that the sword analogy works so well is because if you compare trauma, any kind of trauma, to being pierced with a sword, when you remove it and deal with the healing, and then you have it, this is a great example that the trauma that you went through is not you. Do you see that? This is the trauma. The sword is the trauma, right? So it's not you. You don't have to have a big neon sign on your face or like above your head of like, victim, I was an incest survivor, a rape survivor, I went through domestic violence, like, victim, here you go, victim. We'll talk about how you can remove those signs in another section. So the key to seeing the sword is when you have it, and it's when we've purged the pain and we've healed the wound, and then you have the sword. Now this is about using all of your experiences in your life to do better in the world. That's why there's a step, using the sword. So learning to use all those past triggers, all the things that come up for you when you're wounded, to use that in a healthy way in your life. And then the last step of the sword is learning to play with it. Because you reclaim your childhood, you reclaim that part of your life, you reclaim, you take away all the triggers and all that stuff that the trauma originally caused. That's why this analogy works so well, because when you see it, okay, trauma is the sword. We were going to remove it, and then you have it, and then you can learn to play with it. Now, that is healing and at a whole nother level. Now, when you're at the beginning stages of wounded by it, kind of like when you've just been through trauma, you cannot say to somebody, oh yeah, you're going to learn to play with that, because that's horrible, and you're just not at a place to hear that. But I'm explaining the sword of trauma. The whole picture is, the trauma is you're wounded by it. You have to acknowledge that yes, you were wounded by it. Then you remove it, you heal the wound, you learn to use it, and then you can play with it. Now, all those stages are literally stages that you go through and that we're going to go through in this whole course. Now, again, when you're at the beginning, it's very hard to see the last few steps because you're traumatized. It makes total sense. Now, this whole process is to work with your therapist, your support group, on your own if you're working through the workbook. So that sums up the sword of trauma and what we're going to talk about in this whole course. So let's get started. I'm excited.